Welcome to our first reading video. Today I'll be reading 2 chapters of Poor Richard by James Darney. Chapter 1. Across the neck, the narrow strip of land that was sometimes underwater at high tide, Boston town sat proudly on her hills. On the highest hill of all, the beacon shone at night over the dark bay. On one side, the well-built town sloped down to the busy waterfront. On the outskirts was the common, where the cows of the citizens grazed under the casual eye of the town cowherd. Under the great elm nearby played little boys who were sent to bring home the family cows. Boston was not 100 years old, but the common held grim memories. From this very elm, it was said, Mary Dyer and the Quakers had been hanged for defying the banishment of the Lord's brethren. Already, Boston history was a stern drama of persecution and heroisms. Soul, liberty, and conscience were burning convictions by which men and women lived and died. Merchant ships from England and the Barbados unloaded at the Long Wharf, and the waterfront streets were jammed with carts, ox sledges, and human burden bearers. Reckless gallopers sent children scuttling from under hoof. On Sunday, the church bells rang, and saints and sinners both kept the iron Puritan Sabbath. But on weekdays and nights, the spirit of Merry England made the swarming taverns and coffee houses lively with gay debate and laughter. Though unlighted streets and lurking footpaths made wayfaring after dark an uncertain adventure. Besides the taverns and churches, there were some half-dozen bookshops. There was plenty of rum, religion, and learning. And with it all, Boston was the best ordered and most decent town in all the King's colonies. Across Milk Street from the door of Old South Church lived Josiah Franklin and his numerous family. He didn't have far to carry the newest arrival on a Sunday morning in January 1706, to have him christened Benjamin, after his uncle in England. If being born on Sunday broke the Boston Sabbath, Father Franklin straightened it all out by having him baptized into church right on the same day. You could hardly have walked down Milk Street without stepping on a Franklin among the small fry that played in the dust and mire of that quiet thoroughfare. Over the doorstep where they played was suspended a curious blue ball. Everyone knew that Josiah, the respectable tallow chandler, lived there. Nobody knew or cared what, if anything, the blue ball meant, but to the Franklins, small and large, it marked the snug house that was to them a peaceful refuge and a home. Josiah soon bought a new house on Hanover Street and moved his family there along with the blue ball. Only Mother Franklin knew exactly just how many children there were. The neighbors had long before lost count. The quiet lane was their teeming world as they played at settlers and Indians, pursued stray cats and pigs, and shared their joys with numerous mongrel pups and homeless hound dogs in the mud of democratic Milk Street. In all, there were 15 Franklin children. 5 were by Josiah's first wife, Anne, who had come with him from England and died. 10 were Abiah's children. Benjamin was the youngest son, but had 2 younger sisters. He remembered sitting at table when there were 13 children present at one time. At supper time, they were all rounded up and accounted for. When their noses were wiped and their faces washed, they took their ordered places at the long table where Father Josiah and Mother Abiah sat at each end and bent their heads in grace in the yellow candlelight. Abiah was Josiah's second wife and was the daughter of rare old Peter Folger from Nantucket, surveyor and friend of the Indians who, when the authorities in Boston were cropping Quakers' ears and whipping Baptists, had piped up with doggerel verses against persecution, the sin of Boston, as he called it, adding at the end, I would not have you for to think, though I have wrote so much, that I hereby do throw a stone at magistrates as such. This last was just to keep his own ears safely on each side of his shrewd old head. Abia was a placid woman, wise and wide, who had borne and nursed her little army of 10 children, comforted and cradled them until, as their legs and thoughts grew longer, she turned them over to Father Josiah to fit them for some useful trade and an honest living in a rough handmade world where fortune might be hard earned by the virtuous. Josiah himself had found it to be so. He had come from Banbury to Boston in the year 1683 with his wife and 3 children. The great town had small use for the vanities of the dyer's trade, so he had turned candle maker and done well, lighting the town with excellent wicks and tallow and living decently under the eyes of the sober elders of the prospering merchant city. There was always plenty of interesting talk at supper time. When the big family got together after a busy day and sat around the long table with a friend or neighbor for guests, Father Franklin thought that good talk around the supper table, sharing ideas and discussion, held the family together. The talk was usually so interesting that they hardly ever noticed what the food was like. After supper, they all got together for some homemade music, singing hymns, or listening with admiration to Father playing the fiddle. They learned how to make their own fun and share it. And a big family affection circled and was kept warm, but little Ben wished that Father wouldn't take such a very long time saying grace before meals. It seemed sometimes that he never would get through. One day, when Ben was helping to salt down the winter supply of meat, he had a great idea. Father, why don't you say a grace right now over the whole pig? And then we won't have to say it over every feast at meals. But Father didn't like the idea. So at mealtimes, Ben learned to study the wall map of the 2 hemispheres that hung in the dining room, out of the corner of his eye, while Franklin took his own time about saying grace. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Printer's Ink. Ink, printer's ink, and the sharp smell of it in his nose as he ground the black powder in the thick oil, or inked the type forms with the heavy roller. So he was going to be a printer, and he liked it already. He liked to pull the heavy lever of the press and feel the bite of its powerful grip. He thrilled at pulling the damp white paper from the sticky plate and seeing the sharp, wet impression of the letters all in order, just as he had set them. He had enjoyed his year at school and being head of the class, but he understood how Father Franklin could not afford to pay for his education, with so many others to look after and to start on the way to being useful citizens in the town of Boston. Now he was 12 years old and he had a trade. He was bound out to serve as apprentice for 7 years in his older brother's printing shop. So at 6 on a May morning, he opened the shop and got things ready, ink and paper, and even set some type before the printers came. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of the harbor and the masts and drying sails of schooners in from the Barbados. Like every other small boy in Boston, he had dreamed of running away to sea. His brother-in-law had run away and had become a ship's captain. Instead, he had written a ballad called The Lighthouse Tragedy. Much to the delight of his eccentric Uncle Ben, who had come from England, it was very sad and exciting about the drowning of the lighthouse keeper and his family. His brother James had printed it, and Ben peddled it in the town with great success. So he wrote another about Blackbeard, the pirate, who had recently been captured and hanged. But Boston was not interested in pirates just then, and the ballad did not sell. Father Franklin had laughed and said it was a very bad poem. So young Ben wrote no more doggerel. Yes, he liked the clean smell of printer's ink, the little lead-in letters spelling out words and sentences, the stout English-made press that impressed the type so clearly made a very exciting game. And there wasn't a trick of hand or screw in the press that his sharp wits and clever fingers had not mastered in every short time. He was a bright apprentice, and he knew it, though his brother used him very roughly sometimes just to keep him in his place. But for the most part, he got on well with his fellows and the people who came to the printers. Every day, the hand press sent out armies of words that could make people laugh, cry, be angry, or pleased. To be master of the words, that was the thing. That was the worthwhile thing. To use words as tools, weapons, trumpets, or comforters. To make people understand and be persuaded. It would be fine, he thought, to conquer the world and root the armies of darkness by writing and printing words. It could not be done all at once. He must read books, and they were costly to buy. But he could borrow one overnight, sometimes from his friend, the bookseller's apprentice. There was Master Matthew Adams, who came often to the shop and laughed and talked with the apprentice. He would let Ben use his fine library. So the apprentice borrowed books. He ate lean and bought books. He helped himself to tallow candles at his father's shop and took plenty of paper from the printers. He read and wrote late and early. At noon hour or on Sundays, you could look in through the window of the printer's shop and see Ben lost in Plutarch's Lives or Pilgrim's Progress. A grammar or on arithmetic, the elegant essays in the London Spectator. He studied carefully and then wrote again from memory to find out his faults and do better. It was as natural for Ben to read books as for a squirrel to crack nuts. He ate up such meaty subjects as the art of thinking an essay concerning human understanding. When he read Plato, I was charmed with it, adopted it, dropped my abrupt contradictions in positive argumentation, and put on the humble inquirer. He was much impressed by Essays to Do Good by Cotton Mather. He took good advice from books and people. He learned to take his brother's ill treatment without resentment. People were amused and amazed at the genial wisdom of the well-mannered, well-read boy at the printer's shop. They laughed at the stories of his invention for swimming with hand and foot paddles, and at times he towed himself across the pond by holding on to the string of his kite. Boston was the largest city in America in 1720, with a population of 12,000 inhabitants and 2 newspapers, the Boston Newsletter and the Boston Gazette. They were owned and published by the postmasters, who read the mail public and private. And using the mail carriers for free delivery, were able to distribute news at the earliest possible moment and at every little expense. In spite of these advantages, these sheets were so dull that many people were delighted when the publication of a newspaper, to be called the New England Courant, was announced to drive the dim and dullness from Beacon Hill. James Franklin was the owner, editor, and publisher. Ben, besides setting type and printing the sheets, was employed to carry the paper through the streets to the customers. To use his own words, these were busy days for 16-year-old Ben. The new paper was full of sly, fun, and satire. Besides, the news there were long-winded letters poking fun at things in Boston. One morning, Ben handed in a mysterious letter. He said he had found it under the door of the shop. It was signed, Silence Do Good. It began, Sir, it may not be improper in the first place to inform your readers that I intend once a fortnight to present them by the help of this paper, with a short epistle which I presume will add somewhat to their entertainment. Ben smiled slyly when his brother told him to set it up for the next issue. He never joined in the laughter at the mysterious Silence Dogood's weekly letter, which was soon helping to make the paper popular in its war on the demon dullness. Other contributors signed their names: Ichabod Henroost, Abigail Afterwit, Tabitha Talkative, or Homespun Jack. There was a breezy feeling of free speech and democracy in their remarks about the way things were. Silence Dogood ridiculed high-sounding titles and snobbering by saying, in old time it was no disrespect for men and women to be called by their own names. Adam was never called Master Adam. We never read of Noah Esquire nor the Right Honorable Abraham. Viscount Mesopotamia, Baron of Canaan. No. They were plain men, honest country grazers, that took care of their families and their flocks. This amused plain Bible-loving Boston, with no taste for frills and fancy titles. Silence Dogood was the racy Yankee wit of young America, speaking her mind with a native twang. Silence was a skilled user of words that tickled the ribs or delivered a solemn punch that jolted. It was pretty plain for this reason that James Franklin's paper, the New England Courant, was heading jibe. Indeed, that landed James in the Stone Boston jail. It was a sly item saying, "We are advised from Boston that the government of the Massachusetts are fitting out a ship, the Flying Horse, to go after the pirates, to be commanded by Captain Peter Poplin, and 'tis thought he will sail sometime this month, wind and weather permitting." The authorities did not care to have their captains called butterflies. Benjamin found himself the publisher, printer, editor, and printer's devil of his brother's newspaper, in trouble with the authorities, while the real owner was in jail. With the calm and assurance of all his 16 years, he carried on business as usual. Also, Silence Dogood spoke out her mind in print. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech, a thing terrible to public traitors. Ben had been taken up along with his brother. He had talked back boldly to the authorities, but was dismissed with a rebuke as being only an apprentice. James, in the cooler atmosphere of the noisome Boston jail, said he was sorry, and after another month to think it over, was released. All this excitement had increased the circulation of the Courant enormously, and when he returned from jail, James raised the price of the paper. He gave no credit to his apprentice, brother, or to Silence Dogood. He had been discovered late on one night in the person of Ben slipping the fortnightly letter under the shop door. After all, Ben was only an apprentice whose term had not expired, although he was the cleverest one in America. Ben walked out of his brother's shop after a short, sharp quarrel, with his chin in the air, arrogant and angry. "Perhaps I was too saucy and provoking," he wrote long afterwards. He had plenty of friends in Boston, but there would be no jobs for a runaway apprentice. So he secretly boarded a sloop that was bound for New York. He stood at the rail with the wind and the spray in his eyes, and looked back defiantly at Boston, his thoughts all splendid with youth and the sea and liberty. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video. Bye.